Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm joined by Chris Warren. Chris, how you doing today?
I'm doing real well. How are you doing, James?
Excellent. No complaints in the slightest. Today I want to go through a hand with you. This was recently showed in the Redshift Discord, and it's a spot with top two, and just kind of seeing if we can get away from it. So you ready to rock and roll with it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so here's the spot. Have Ace Queen playing 2-5. There's a raise from the hijack, and Hero decides to call. And pausing here for a moment, in the chat, Snowino said that MP2 is kind of an Asian woman in her 30s, has some tattoos, and is considered a tag reg. Good information for us to know. So in this exact situation, and one other factor is that the blinds are pre-folding. So taking that to mean that they are kind of folding out of turn, have made it totally clear that they weren't interested in 20 and probably wouldn't be interested if you decided to 3-bet here. So with that being said, let's start with the preflop inflection point. Do you like calling here or do you prefer 3-betting here?
Yeah, it's real interesting with the variables that we have. So I'll just go and say my default at 2-5 is if I have a tag opening and I have position. I mean, 3-betting is just so insanely appealing because they just don't 4-bet enough, right? So getting to play a larger pot in position, especially with a strong holding like Ace Queen, it's not a balanced play, really. It's just I see so few ways for this to go wrong. I lean towards 3-betting. Is calling okay? I think theoretically it's fine if you really want to take a balanced GTO approach. The issue is that it's like a little bit more complicated to have a balanced calling range in this type of situation. And I think most live players default to calling far too often. And all those factors tend to push me towards just recommending 3-betting here.
That's fair enough. I'm kind of in the boat of I'm not going to fault someone for calling this. I mean, obviously, I'm never folding here. I think calling is kind of the more comfortable option that most players tend to go with. I agree with you. I think there's some extra validity to 3-betting, and just watching, like, kind of tag regs in general just don't tend to respond all that great against 3-bets anyway. Most of them either are massively overfolding or massively over continuing, and hopefully you have some bit of info on that. If you don't, probably time to start doing some more 3-betting and seeing how they react to get some information quite quickly. But yeah, I think 3-betting is slightly better here. But again, I'm never shocked to see the call in this exact situation. I think, again, it is kind of the more comfortable option. But as played, we end up going heads up to it, blinds fold, end up flopping top two, like we talked about, and MP2 fires for 25. Hero decides to raise to 65. So first thoughts here.
Yeah, so something that's very important to note in this flop, this is the absolute first thing that I think about, is who has the nut advantage here? Who has the range advantage? And if we look at a pot where our opponent called or raised and we called, and we look at a flop that has an ace, a queen, immediately we should know we don't have aces and queens in our flat call range, or we shouldn't. you basically, even on a GTO approach, even like balanced approaches, you will never have a flat call range here with aces and queens. The only way it would ever happen is if you're making some very tricky play due to like expected squeezing, right? And those are plays that you need to have a very, very high degree of confidence in. And I think even then you typically tend to use hands more like ace king as a preference. So
and we really should for sure, because we know the blinds are pre-folding. So like there's no way in hell aces or queens are going to be in Hero's pre-flop range here. Just no chance.
Yeah, exactly. So this is an incredibly important part of this hand when you look at an ace queen 6 or rainbow flop. I mean, there's just no way that you have a lot of strong hands here compared to your opponent. You should be 3-betting your ace queens a good percentage of the time. That's going to trim you down even more. And yeah, this is just a wild flop for your opponent in terms of strength. Because of that, the way we typically handle that situation is that we have to basically turn our entire range into just a call or fold range, and we shouldn't really have any raises. So that, I think, is, from a balance perspective, just really clear cut. That's immediately where my mind goes.
And I think that's totally fair. Just You said it really, really well there. Thinking about who has nutted range advantage, and just it's so difficult for hero to have nuts. I mean, he can have a6 suited and pocket sixes, but those are like the strongest combos in their range. Whereas the hijack can have all of pocket aces, all of pocket queens, all of ace queen, probably also pocket sixes as well. I would have to imagine.
Hmm.
This is just not looking great for us. So yeah, I think taking the call here, make decisions on future streets makes a lot more sense rather than raising. And again, there's just not much that should really be not much of a raising range here in the first place. I'm not sure if you know off the top of your head, but if like we were running this through a solver and we didn't run this particular hand through a solver, but would there be like some percentage of raising? Do you think on this kind of board, or like it would just take everything and shunt it into folder call?
In my experience, this will be 100% call. There will not be any raising option realistically. Maybe a 0.1%. Sometimes that happens, but I don't think there would be. Pragmatically, we wouldn't want to do it for simplification reasons. We would just say,
Sure.
well, this tiny percentage doesn't matter. We'll just make the default play. So then the other question that we have to ask is like, okay, is there any exploitative value to raising?
There you go.
That's where it gets interesting. That's where it does get interesting. And I think because this flop has this dynamic, and I think this dynamic is so clear cut, like even players who are not thinking on this level will tend to recognize it when forced to think about it when you raise them. And yeah, it could get weird if you raise someone. And for that reason, I have to say I don't hate it. Definitely the most defensible play is, of course, call, but like, could you get someone to wig out if you raise them? Yeah, like certainly plausible. If I'm in the MP2's position and someone raises me on this board, I'm like, excuse me, sir, what are you doing? And
Precisely.
yeah, so how do you? I mean, I'm sure you would react to that one too, right?
It's one like if you have that nugget of information on your opponent, you're like, okay, I know I can kind of like jiggle that goofball switch if I throw in some goofy little raise here. And I mean, size wise, this is just the whole thing is just hilarious, right? It's just it doesn't look it just looks silly. Uh, but you have to know that your opponent is actually going to react to that silliness. Otherwise, you're just kind of allowing them to play totally perfect. And you know, what's the worst hand they continue with here? Maybe kings, but like jacks down, that's all going to go dump. And you're really doing this, if I'm looking at this, either to try to jiggle someone to do something really silly, or because you're trying to just go like balls to the wall value against like ace 10, ace jack, ace king that can't find the fold button.
Yeah.
But like if
And are
I'm
we going
looking
to
at a
have
tag,
that much trouble extracting from those hands by betting the turn if they check? It's like seems
that, that
questionable.
that's exactly it, right? Because is a tag reg. Like I hear those two words together, and I'm like, that person's not putting 100 bigs in with ace king even most of the time here. Like they're just gonna like maybe call the raise and then probably check call turn and then probably check panic against a big bet on the river, which means you probably have to go more small to medium on the river. And it's like you could have probably almost certainly gotten more value by calling here and letting them make more mistakes for more money with that hand, yet alone the rest of their range. So I just don't see this. I mean, without very specific exploitative information, I don't see the raise here really doing all that much.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I do. I like the idea of playing around with it. Like I imagine, like you and I were playing. You see bet on me, into me on this board. For some reason, I've flatted ace queen against you pre-flop. That's really cool for me because now I'm in a small percentage of my range. Can I just min raise you on the flop and expect some wild stuff to happen? I kind of
Sure.
like that. I
Yeah.
do. Like it's, but it really requires kind of like an advanced metagame of someone who's going to like assume that you're messing around and get really uncomfortable versus like I think a standard tag reg in a live game is going to be like, oh, like they shouldn't be raising here a lot. I guess they're really strong, which is what you are. And so that's not a great, you need a bit of a leveling game for this to kind of play out favorably. So default play definitely has to be flat call, but we did in fact raise here. So we'll have to run with that a little bit.
We did. And the raising is not done on the street because we end up facing a 3-bet from the hijack up to 145 total, getting a little better than 3-1 odds at this point, and I can't ever find a fold. So the only question for me is, do we call here or do we stuff it in? So what are you thinking at this stage in the game?
pretty much, again, now we're going to have to lean, I think, even more heavily into the fact that like we shouldn't be in here raising very often. And now we're getting just like good odds to call. We're in position. This is one of those situations where I would call with like a lot of my gut shot hands, probably even just to like see if they bet the turn and see what happens. Like we're getting odds on
Yep.
just seeing what happens in a sense. And yeah, I'm pretty much going to have to flat call my strong hands here as well. So I don't see any reason to ship it. There's no scare cards coming on the turn. Realistically, maybe the king would be like, I mean, it's bad for us, but trying to think what would scare ace king. I guess a jack could be scary, or a 10 could be kind of scary. There's just not a lot of bad cards that would sort of kill our action, so to speak. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I don't see stuff in it here really doing anything other than just letting. If there are any goofball bluffs in the hijacks range, why not give them a chance to barrel bomb it on the turn or something?
Yeah.
I think just calling here is just totally standard and make decisions on the turn, and those decisions pretty much don't include trying to find a fold somewhere.
And I think that considering those goofball bluffs, it doesn't seem that significant to most people when they look at this type of action. But now it actually becomes really, really important, because this is a hand where all of a sudden we're dealing with, well, what do they value raise you here with, right? Probably ace queen and aces and queens and sixes. And that sounds like a lot of hands. When you actually look at the combos, because we block ace queen combos, it's like very, very few combos. There's what? 4 combinations of ace queen. There's 1 combination of aces left, 1 combination of queens left, 3 combination of sixes left. So out of all the potential opening hands that this MP2 player has, we are now left with something like 9 combinations or something, if I counted correctly. So those goofball bluffs, while they don't seem very significant, all out of all the hands she might have opened now, they're going to start accounting for a huge percentage of her range, theoretically, right? Maybe she never bluffs here, but if she does, and I think, and this is why it's so important, I think, for people to understand that small percentage things, when you're deep into a poker hand like this, start to become very, very important. Could your opponent really never bluff here? Are you sure? 100% sure she's never bluffing here just because she's a tag? I will say, over my career, I've always experienced, I think I told a story about this in the last podcast. I've always allowed more ability for my opponents to bluff than I think most people do. And repeatedly over time, I find that those crazy bluffs do show up from time to time. It is still, it is kind of a smaller percentage thing. That is true. But you just never know. Like the ability to say your opponent wouldn't bluff here with like king jack 5% of the time, jack 10 5% of the time. It's, other players are thinking players too. They are looking for these spots. People have, people are people. They're not totally disciplined. So that plays in. They just maybe want to come after you on a board that's really strong for them. That's actually not the craziest idea. So just remember, saying that you just know that someone's not bluffing here is generally too crazy with such a strong hand compared to, like, you're at the absolute top of your range realistically, besides sixes. And yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on.
Yep. I think that is 100% fair. And yep, here it does decide to call. Very happy about that. Turn is a 5, puts up the backdoor flush draw, and hijack decides to continue, this time for 275. So before we talk about what Hero did in this situation, what are your thoughts facing this bet?
Pretty much, I would say, re-emphasizes the scenario we experienced with the 3-bet on the flop. Basically, our opponent is telling us, A, they are either very, very strong, or B, they are, really coming after you with a crazy bluff. That's about it, right? Like, there's not like any draws that make sense to push their equity. They could have picked it up on the turn now, but those would have been pretty crazy bluffs on the flop. So you're in the same situation, really. So you're basically in the same situation, and we're in the same spot where we're dealing with a condensed part of our range. And the poster in this hand was starting to question, okay, well, this is a tag, like they're clearly not bluffing very often here. Should I be starting to think about folding? So how do you think about folding here, James?
I mean, you don't have a crowbar big enough to get me to fold this, is kind of my thought. And it's just one of those, like, the whole reason why we would raise the flop is because you think, not whole, but there's a good chunk of, if you're raising the flop, it's because you think you're inducing some sort of mistake somewhere along the way. They're going to make some pretty large mistakes against the raise itself. So we've kind of seen a bunch of action happen after that, right? We saw that flop three bet. Now we're seeing the big barrel here. So, like, I have to assume, again, what went into my original raise is that there's going to be some goofy stuff happening here. So to say, hey, there should be some goofy stuff happening here, but then panic and say, no, 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 it's only the nuts now. There's a mismatch somewhere along the way. And I think going and changing your plan to, I'm going to find a fold button here, especially on this card, like, I just don't see it. And not even just this card, like pretty much the entirety of the deck. Like, there's just not a crowbar big enough for me to get away from this. If they do happen to have the nuts or something close to it, like, again, that was baked into the equation. It's going to happen some chunk of the time. But am I really, really all of a sudden stone confident that they only have sixes, aces, queens, ace, queen? I don't think you can say that with all certainty based upon the reasoning that would probably go into the flop play. And as such, I would just stick it in here. I always look at this and I'm like, well, could I call? But if I call, I don't really rep anything that's probably going to fold ever. And I don't really think that they're super incentivized to, like, throw in their last, like, what, 130 ish on the river. So
No.
if they're going to make a mistake, it's, I'm going to try to max value against ace king or maybe some sort of backdoor clubs that just picked up. Let's just get it all in now and be done with it. There's just really no river play anyway, whether we call or shove in this spot.
Yeah, 100% shove for me on the turn as well. And the reasoning is like you said, if we're getting stacked, we're getting it all in behind anyways. And so if we want to get it all in ahead and they want to chase their gut shot for their last 100, which will happen, like, yeah, we gotta shove there.
Yep.
And yeah, I pretty much agree with you as well. Like, it's just I think you can understand why we wanted to flat call the flop, and maybe think, when you're in this situation, you're like, oh, I really don't like the variables here where I've created a very tight range for my opponent and now they're showing strength and against my very strong hand, and I don't feel good about it anymore. This is part of the reason why we flat call on the flop and why that's the most defensible, balanced play, is because we just don't want to put our tag opponents in situations where they will only continue with strong hands, because there's just a better way to handle any type of situation where we find ourselves in that spot. Usually there's going to be a line that would have kept their range wider, given us more flexibility and maneuverability with our ranges and ability to generate mistakes. And I think so. It is very common to end up in this situation and have some regret. And that's fine. Like, we have to learn from these situations. It's like, it's a pretty extreme flop. And so it makes sense that someone wouldn't have, like, the understanding that we don't raise that flop and just may have defaulted there. So don't beat yourself up about it. This is a great learning opportunity to understand the dynamics on this type of flop. And yeah, if you're really just playing that standard tag, flatting the flop gives you so many options against their middle strength hands, etc. Does Chris like the crazy raise play on the flop if there can be a metagame there? Yeah, it's not the wildest thing in the world, but when you do that, or if you just find yourself having regret in these situations, it's just one of those situations where it's time to make them show you the cards, and if you get stacked, you get stacked.
Correct. And I think you said it really well, and just to, like, reiterate it, there's a reason why you can raise the flop against me, right? Because you know that I'm likely to kind of go goofy when that happens. I'm going to look at the spot the same way you look at the spot, and we're just going to both giggle and just throw a bunch of weird money in there. Whereas the normal tag reg, who has no creativity in their game, they're just going to be super predictable. And as such, you've completely condensed their range to, like, only the nuts. You've nullified all the rest of their nonsense. Not always, but to a super large degree. And now you're kind of walking back what went into the original flop raise. So be very careful with that. And, just always go back and recheck whether or not the line leading up to the big spots made sense. And that's why, having the conversation about three betting preflop is actually very important. Having the discussion about whether or not we raise the flop or not is extremely important, rather than just focusing on this turn spot. Because I think a lot of people only want to focus on the turn spot. Should we fold at this point? Because this is a big bet from a tag reg. Should we fold here? Well, we have to look at everything leading up to that point, because that's what's going to impact whether or not that range is, having enough bluffs in it or nowhere near enough bluffs. You got to be really careful with that and kind of stay consistent throughout the hand when you're thinking about the hand reading and the range you're assigning. Excellent. So as played, here decides to mash it in. Totally happy as played. MP2 calls. Unfortunately, ends up having pocket sixes. Here ends up losing the pot. Is what it is. And I think this is one of those spots that gets asked about because, it sucks when we lose with top two. And it's like, well, did I make a mistake here? Some spots are coolers, and obviously the setup itself is pretty cooler, and you're going to lose a big pot one way or the other. So don't panic about that.
Unless maybe you 3-bet.
Unless maybe you 3-bet. Yeah, precisely. Post flop as played, like a lot of money's going in here. Just is what it is. But yeah, don't beat yourself up over that. But ask yourself, did you play well leading up to the big spot? 3-betting preflop, very, very important. Yeah, because you're right. Sixes probably go away when there's a 3-bet.
Decent percentage chance if that's a good tag. I mean, there's a lot of tags who will call you there with it. But this is actually one of the reasons I love 3-betting in these small stakes live games is that taking the balanced line in all these scenarios can be pretty challenging. It's a difficult thing to do, right? Like just knowing that that you have the nut disadvantage on this flop. That's a pretty advanced idea that I think a lot of people will be less comfortable navigating on the fly in the moment. I think we can all see it after the fact pretty obviously. So because of that, when you take an approach where you lean on 3-betting a bit more, what you're doing is you're inflating the size of the pot when you're in position as well, with strong hands when you have a very tight range. And the benefits of that are when this flop does come out, essentially if your opponent called you with sixes, it's probably a bit of a loose call from a GTO perspective. Also, if you have a skill advantage on them, playing sixes out of position is going to be very, very difficult to do profitably. And because of that, if they do make that call, essentially what's happening is you're actually creating a negative EV sort of lottery for them, where it's like, okay, if you 3-bet and then you have a strong hand and they end up hitting a set, you do lose a big pot. But on average, you will now be profiting. And you're doing so, and you're creating a bigger pot. So when you do get stacked, it's actually not as big a deal. You'll be creating a bigger pot for you to just kind of pick up because they're a tag and they're just playing real straightforward and you have position and it'll be easy to pick some nice, easy bluffs. You'll be able to show down your hand more frequently than you probably should otherwise when you're out of position. So you can just chuck down when your ace high is good. And you'll have an easier time sniping their bluffs because they'll basically you'll tend to have the actual range cap because you 3-bet before the flop. So there's just so many favorable scenarios that actually make playing this as a 3-bet easier, which I think is the opposite that most people think of. They think, oh, I'm going to call and I'm going to keep all the things on lockdown and control. But actually, you create a bigger pot. You don't have to deal with as much complexity. And if you do that in position, it's like you get a bigger pot with more advantages in position, and it's simpler for you, and it's super complicated for your opponent to manage. Those are scenarios that I just personally love. So something to consider at small stakes. This is something that I employ when I play 2-5 and 5-10. Just lean on a 3-bet heavy strategy, especially in position, especially against people who do not 4-bet you as a bluff. So yeah, that's my pitch for 3-betting live lot.
I like it. And I especially think it's a fair point of they don't 4-bet very often. Yes. Hardly ever. I mean, tag regs and live games just in general, doesn't matter if it's 1-2, 2-5, or 5-10. It just doesn't come in that much. So what are they going to do? They're going to flat with all their continuance. They're going to fold a lot, so you can just print money that way. Or they call, and again, post flop's not all that difficult. So
we're never uncomfortable playing ace queen in position post flop.
Exactly. So people always panic about, should I put ace queen at the bottom of my 3-bet range or the top of my calling range? And I get the conversation, but just think about in general how your opponents are going to make the most amount of mistakes, and are they playing really well in 3-bet pots? I don't think so.
Chances are they aren't. Chances are they aren't.
Exactly. So yeah, I think this was a good one. I really appreciate Snowino. Thank you for posting this in the Discord. Chris, any last minute thoughts on this one?
No, I think we covered it.
I think we covered it too. Excellent. So if you want to post your own hand, you can always do so in the Discord. That's redchippoker.com/Discord to get in there immediately and post it either over on the side. You see live hands or online hands or tournament hands. So post it in wherever it goes, and we look forward to talking more poker with you over there. If you need anything in the meantime, don't hesitate to let us know. Otherwise, as always, good luck out there and happy grinding.